People love believing that time changes everyone. They say pain changes people, love changes people, failure changes people, success changes people. But the terrifying truth about human psychology is that many people never truly change at all. They only become more exposed over time. The lies become harder to hide. The emotional masks begin slipping. The behaviors become more obvious. And eventually, the real personality underneath reveals itself completely. Tonight, you're going to understand one of the darkest truths about human nature: why some people never change. Because once you understand the psychology behind ego, trauma, emotional conditioning, identity, addiction, insecurity, and self-awareness, you will never look at people the same way again. Think about it carefully. How many times have you heard someone promise they would become different? Someone says they'll stop lying, stop hurting people, stop being toxic, stop manipulating, stop disappearing, stop repeating the same mistakes. And maybe for a short period, they appear different. Their behavior improves temporarily. They speak differently, act differently, seem emotionally aware. But eventually, the same patterns return. The same arguments, the same emotional chaos, the same selfish behavior, the same manipulation. And the most painful part is realizing they were never truly changing. They were only temporarily adapting. Human beings are creatures of patterns. The brain is designed to repeat familiar emotional behaviors because familiarity feels psychologically safe, even when those behaviors are destructive. Neuroscientists explain that repeated thoughts, emotions, and behaviors create neural pathways inside the brain. The more a person repeats certain emotional reactions, the stronger those psychological patterns become. Over time, behavior becomes automatic. This means many people are not consciously choosing their reactions anymore. They are operating from deeply conditioned emotional programming developed over years of experiences, trauma, habits, and survival mechanisms. This is why change is so difficult. Real change requires destroying psychological comfort zones the brain spent years building for emotional survival. And most people are terrified of that process. One of the biggest reasons people never change is because they never truly confront themselves. Self-awareness is psychologically painful. It requires honesty, accountability, reflection, emotional responsibility. And many humans spend their entire lives avoiding those things. Instead of facing uncomfortable truths, people blame circumstances, blame trauma, blame childhood, blame relationships, blame stress, blame bad luck, blame other people. The ego protects itself by avoiding guilt and shame, because admitting harmful behavior threatens a person's self-image. Psychologists call this ego defense. The human mind constantly creates emotional excuses to protect identity. Someone manipulative convinces themselves they are misunderstood. Someone toxic convinces themselves everyone else is sensitive. Someone emotionally unavailable convinces themselves they simply need space. Someone selfish convinces themselves they are protecting their peace. The mind becomes extremely creative when protecting ego from accountability. This is why some people repeat destructive behavior for decades without feeling genuine remorse. Their brain has psychologically rewritten reality in a way that protects their self-image. There's also another terrifying truth. Some people never change because their environment rewards their behavior. Human beings repeat behaviors that produce emotional, social, financial, or psychological rewards. A manipulative person who gains control through emotional games has little motivation to stop. A toxic individual who still receives attention despite destructive behavior learns that consequences are temporary. Someone who lies successfully learns dishonesty works. The brain reinforces whatever behavior achieves survival, pleasure, validation, power, or comfort. This means change rarely happens through words alone. Pain is often the real catalyst for transformation. Human beings usually change only when remaining the same becomes more painful than evolving. Until consequences become unbearable, most individuals continue repeating familiar patterns. And unfortunately, many people never experience consequences strong enough to force real self-reflection. Childhood psychology also plays a massive role in why people remain emotionally trapped. The human personality develops heavily during childhood experiences. Trauma, neglect, emotional inconsistency, abandonment, criticism, manipulation, unstable environments, all of these shape the nervous system and emotional behavior patterns. Someone raised around chaos may unconsciously associate chaos with love. Someone raised around emotional neglect may struggle expressing vulnerability. Someone constantly criticized may become defensive and emotionally reactive throughout adulthood. The frightening part is that many adults never realize they are still psychologically reacting from childhood wounds decades later. This is why emotionally immature people often repeat the same relationship patterns endlessly. Different faces, same emotional outcome, different relationship, same toxic cycle, different promises, same ending. Because external situations change while internal psychology remains untouched. Another reason people never change is identity attachment. Humans become emotionally attached to familiar versions of themselves, even unhealthy ones. A person who spent years identifying as angry, damaged, emotionally cold, or self-destructive may unconsciously resist healing because change threatens their identity. If someone has built their entire personality around being the victim, the tough one, the broken one, or the misunderstood one, personal growth creates psychological confusion. Because without the old pain, they no longer know who they are. And this is something most people never talk about. Healing sounds beautiful in theory, but psychologically it can feel terrifying. Real healing requires grieving old identities, old coping mechanisms, old emotional addictions, and old versions of self. Many people would rather remain emotionally familiar than psychologically uncertain. Fear also plays a major role in why humans resist change. Change creates unpredictability. The brain naturally fears uncertainty because uncertainty feels dangerous to survival. Even toxic routines can feel emotionally safer than unfamiliar growth. This is why people stay in destructive relationships, harmful environments, emotional dependency, addiction cycles, or repetitive self-sabotage. The pain becomes familiar, and familiarity creates psychological comfort. One of the darkest truths about human behavior is that many people are addicted to emotional patterns they claim to hate. Some people are addicted to chaos. Others are addicted to victimhood. Some are addicted to emotional drama, toxicity, validation, attention, anger, or manipulation. The brain becomes chemically attached to emotional states repeated over long periods. Stress hormones themselves can become psychologically addictive. This explains why some individuals repeatedly destroy healthy relationships. Peace feels emotionally boring to a nervous system trained for chaos. Stability feels suspicious. Calmness feels unfamiliar. So the brain unconsciously recreates conflict because emotional dysfunction became normalized internally. There's also the psychology of emotional comfort zones. Human beings naturally avoid emotional discomfort whenever possible. Growth requires discomfort. Accountability requires discomfort. Change requires discomfort. But modern psychology reveals that most people prioritize short-term emotional relief over long-term transformation. Instead of confronting difficult truths, they distract themselves. Social media, entertainment, relationships, validation, work, pleasure, attention, anything to avoid sitting alone with uncomfortable self-awareness. And the longer avoidance continues, the harder change becomes. Social environments reinforce this problem even more. Humans are heavily influenced by the people around them. If someone is surrounded by individuals enabling toxic behavior, real change becomes unlikely. Friend groups normalize destructive habits constantly. Toxicity becomes humor. Manipulation becomes personality. Emotional immaturity becomes identity. People adapt psychologically to whatever behavior their environment rewards. This is why growth sometimes requires isolation. Not because loneliness is healthy forever, but because certain environments psychologically trap people inside old identities. There's another painful truth about why some people never change. They don't actually want to. Many individuals love the idea of change more than the reality of transformation. They want the rewards of becoming better without the sacrifice required to evolve. They want peace without accountability, confidence without discipline, emotional maturity without self-reflection, healthy relationships without emotional responsibility. But psychology repeatedly shows something important. Intention alone changes nothing. Awareness alone changes nothing. Words alone change nothing. Real transformation requires consistent behavioral repetition over long periods of discomfort. And most humans give up long before reaching that point. The ego resists change because change forces people to admit the previous version of themselves was harmful, immature, insecure, or wrong. And for many individuals, that realization creates unbearable shame. So instead of evolving, they defend old behavior aggressively. This is why some people become angry when confronted with truth. The confrontation threatens identity stability. There's also another disturbing psychological phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. When someone's actions conflict with their self-image, the brain experiences emotional discomfort. To reduce this discomfort, people often distort reality instead of changing behavior. A dishonest person convinces themselves honesty is weakness. A cruel person convinces themselves others deserve it. A selfish person convinces themselves they're simply prioritizing self-care. The mind protects identity at almost any cost. This is why logic alone rarely changes people. Emotional readiness matters more than information. You cannot force self-awareness onto someone emotionally committed to denial. Love also fails to change many people, despite what society teaches. People often believe loving someone deeply enough will heal them emotionally. But healing cannot be outsourced psychologically. You cannot love someone into accountability. You cannot emotionally rescue someone unwilling to confront themselves. And one of the most painful lessons in life is realizing that some people will destroy relationships, opportunities, trust, and even themselves before they ever choose genuine self-reflection. Sometimes people apologize not because they changed, but because they fear losing access to you. That's an important distinction. Temporary behavior improvement is not transformation. Real change is consistent even when consequences disappear. Real change survives discomfort. Real change remains visible over time. But many humans are masters of temporary adaptation. They change behavior just enough to reduce consequences, regain trust, or maintain emotional control. Once stability returns, old patterns quietly reappear because the underlying psychology never evolved. This cycle becomes extremely dangerous in toxic relationships. Hope psychologically traps people. Humans naturally become attached to potential. We remember good moments and ignore repeated patterns because the brain craves emotional reward. Intermittent reinforcement, occasional affection mixed with pain, creates powerful emotional addiction. This is one reason people remain attached to individuals who repeatedly hurt them. The brain becomes addicted to waiting for change that may never come. Another reason people never change is emotional pride. Pride prevents vulnerability. Admitting mistakes requires humility. Seeking help requires vulnerability. Therapy requires vulnerability. Accountability requires vulnerability. But emotionally insecure people often view vulnerability as weakness. They protect pride instead of pursuing growth. This creates emotionally frozen individuals trapped inside defensive behavior for years. There's also the role of modern society. Social media has created environments where people constantly perform identities instead of developing authentic self-awareness. Validation became more important than introspection. Looking emotionally healthy became more important than actually healing. Humans became experts at curating appearances while remaining internally unchanged. And because society rewards image so heavily, many individuals focus more on appearing evolved than truly transforming psychologically. One of the scariest truths about human nature is that some people become comfortable hurting others because empathy weakens through repetition. The more someone normalizes harmful behavior, the less emotional guilt they eventually feel. This is why repeated dishonesty, manipulation, cruelty, or emotional abuse can become psychologically easier over time. The brain adapts morally to repeated actions, but not everyone remains trapped forever. Some individuals truly do change. But genuine transformation usually happens through deep emotional pain, intense self-awareness, severe consequences, spiritual awakening, therapy, isolation, loss, heartbreak, or profound psychological exhaustion. Real change often begins when a person becomes emotionally unable to tolerate their old identity anymore. Transformation requires psychological death of the old self, and that process is extremely painful. Real change also requires consistency. It's not one apology, not one emotional conversation, not one good week. Real growth appears through repeated actions over long periods of time. Changed people move differently, communicate differently, handle conflict differently, accept accountability differently, respect boundaries differently, regulate emotions differently. You do not need to beg genuinely transformed people to behave better repeatedly. Their behavior reveals the transformation naturally. This is why patterns matter more than promises. Humans reveal themselves through repeated behavior. Words create hope. Patterns reveal truth. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this. It is not your responsibility to emotionally destroy yourself trying to save people committed to staying the same. Compassion is beautiful, but self-destruction is not love. Many individuals waste years trying to heal emotionally unavailable people, fix toxic behavior, or rescue broken individuals who never truly wanted transformation in the first place. You cannot force evolution onto someone psychologically attached to dysfunction. And accepting that truth can be heartbreaking. But it's also freeing. Because once you understand human psychology deeply, you stop becoming addicted to potential. You stop confusing temporary effort with permanent change. You stop believing every apology equals transformation. You stop sacrificing your peace waiting for someone to become emotionally ready for accountability. The terrifying reality is that human beings are incredibly resistant to change because identity feels safer than uncertainty. Even painful identities, even destructive ones. But understanding this truth changes the way you see relationships forever. You stop asking why certain people never change despite everything you gave them. Instead, you begin understanding that real transformation only happens when someone becomes emotionally willing to confront themselves honestly, and many people spend their entire lives running from that confrontation. Because the truth is, human psychology is complicated. People crave healing but fear accountability. They want peace but avoid discomfort. They desire transformation but protect ego. They seek love but resist vulnerability. And understanding this won't erase the pain of disappointment completely, but it will stop you from blaming yourself for trying to save people who were never truly ready to change.